Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. On today's episode of Thinking in English, let's discover some of the most common mistakes people make when arguing or debating. Check out the Thinking in English blog for the full transcript of today's episode, and head over to my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, for more excellent English content. Today, we are going to talk about logical fallacies. These are some of the most common mistakes people make when arguing or debating. I think it is a really useful and important thing to learn and understand, so you can avoid and recognize some of these logical fallacies in the future. Some people love to argue and debate, and I am one of those people. Growing up as a lover of history and politics, two subjects over which people are always divided, I have had to learn how to make an argument, how to find evidence, use that evidence to justify my opinion, and then use that evidence again to show the weaknesses in other arguments. However, most people are not very good at arguing or debating. Just spend a few minutes looking through YouTube comment sections, Twitter, Facebook, or even listen to your own family's arguments. You will quickly notice that rather than argue well, people often just insult each other. Learning how to argue effectively and debate well is actually a really important skill in the modern world. Not only does it help in your own personal life, but learning to debate is a highly useful skill in business and academic worlds. Last week, I looked at how to think critically in English and tried to introduce you all to some tips and tricks on how to become more critical in your daily life. This episode is kind of a follow-up episode. Arguing, debating, and critical thinking are all really related. So I recommend you all listen to last week's episode. I'll link it in the description and on the blog. Everyone has argued before. Children argue about what time to go to bed or how long they can play games. Some people argue over sports teams. Businesses argue over prices or services. And I tend to argue over politics. But not every argument is perfect. This is important. Not every argument is perfect. Not every argument is good. And not every argument is equal. Some people's arguments are flawed. They have mistakes. They are deceptive, or they are false. And this is what we call a logical fallacy, a flawed, false, or deceptive argument. It is an error in reasoning or in logic that makes your argument weaker, less effective, and less convincing. A logical fallacy is not necessarily an error in your beliefs, but an error in your reasoning. It is a weak argument. So, what do I mean? Well, let me try and give you some examples. Let's imagine you are arguing with your friend over which restaurant you are going to eat at tonight. You want to eat Indian food, but your friend wants to try a new pizza restaurant. In this argument, there isn't a correct answer, right? Both are good options. However, imagine your friend said this: "We have to eat pizza tonight because you always choose terrible restaurants. So that Indian restaurant is definitely bad." The argument here, that you always choose terrible restaurants, so whatever restaurant you choose will definitely be bad, is an example of a logical fallacy. There is no logic or reason to your friend's argument. Just because you chose a bad restaurant at some point in the past, which they don't give any evidence for, does not mean that you will choose a bad one this time. And it does not mean that that Indian restaurant is bad. Rather than justifying their choice of pizza, your friend rejected your choice, your argument, for no real reason. Logical fallacies are incredibly common. You will see them everywhere on TV, in newspapers, online, in classrooms, and in political debates. And we've all used them before. However, it is really important to be able to identify logical fallacies and avoid using them. So, in the rest of this episode, I'm going to introduce 8 of the most common logical fallacies. I'll give you a definition, explanation, and some examples of each fallacy. Ad hominem. Perhaps the most famous logical fallacy is called ad hominem. Now, this is a Latin word, but essentially it is the use of insults and personal attacks rather than using logic or evidence. This mistake occurs when you reject someone's point of view due to their personal characteristics like age, appearance, ethnicity, or education. Instead of using logic to criticize an argument, ad hominem attacks the person arguing. Rather than focusing on the evidence, the merits, and the flaws in a specific argument, ad hominem uses irrelevant information. In essence, ad hominem is when you attack the person arguing rather than the argument. Here are some examples of ad hominem. Example 1. My dad says it's important that America protects democracy around the world. Well, your dad voted for Donald Trump, so his opinion on democracy is not valid. In this argument, the second person said that just because his friend's dad voted for Donald Trump, it means that his opinion on the entire concept of democracy is no longer valid. He was, rather than arguing about America protecting democracy, the friend was arguing that his dad voted for Donald Trump. He was attacking him for his past political choices. And his example number 2. Sarah said I need to lose a little weight because I'm unhealthy. Sarah smokes cigarettes, so you shouldn't listen to her point of view on health issues. Well, just because Sarah smokes cigarettes doesn't necessarily mean she isn't a good a good authority on this issue. Straw man argument. The next logical fallacy is the straw man argument. This is a very common mistake where you argue a different topic than the one being discussed. Often, the straw man argument occurs by changing to a more extreme version of the issue being discussed, then exaggerating, and then attacking this more extreme or exaggerated point of view. The straw man argument replaces the real issue with one that makes someone seem correct, but doesn't address the real topic. The USA is famous for straw man arguments over gun control. Occasionally, an American politician will suggest regulating assault weapons or handguns, perhaps by increasing age limits or licenses. The response from the pro-gun Americans is always the same. Banning guns is against the US Constitution and a threat to democracy. However, this was not the argument. The argument was not about banning guns entirely, but increasing some small regulations. The straw man fallacy changed the topic of the argument from regulation to a complete ban, and this made the pro gun side stronger. Here is another example. I think pollution from humans contributes to climate change. So, you think humans are directly responsible for droughts, hurricanes, and wildfires? These all happened before humans existed, so you must be wrong. In this argument, the first person was not saying that humans completely are responsible for all climate change and all global warming, but rather that human action contributes, it's part of it. The second person disregarded this part of the argument and exaggerated, making it seem like the first person was being much more extreme than they really are. False dilemma. You either support the government or you hate our country. This is an example of the false dilemma, false dichotomy, or either or fallacy. As much as newspapers, TV shows, and politicians might think the world is split into two different sides, usually just conservative and liberal, this is not actually true. Often there are many different possibilities. Think about the example I gave. You either support the government or you hate our country. Well, that's not true. You can love your country but dislike the government. There are lots of different viewpoints. The false dilemma argument is used to manipulate, polarize, and convince people. It makes it appear as if there are only two possibilities, and you need to choose which one of those possibilities you fall into. But it's not always the case. Here are some more examples. Politicians will often say something like, vote for me or live through more years of high taxes. Well, again, that's not necessarily true. If you vote for the politician, there might still be high taxes. And if you don't vote for them, there might not be high taxes. And next example, if you want to become fluent in English, you need to give me all of your money. Well, of course, that is not true. Slippery slope. The slippery slope fallacy is the name given to an argument that assumes an action you do now will lead to a chain of other actions. It assumes your decision now, which is often not that controversial, will lead to an unlikely, ridiculous, or extreme outcome. And of course, there is no evidence for this. I used this kind of argument all the time when I was younger. Mum, you have to let me watch that movie. If I don't watch that movie, I won't be able to talk about it at school tomorrow. And then everyone will laugh at me and I'll have no friends. Assuming that the initial action, not watching a movie, will eventually lead to an extreme situation, having no friends, is the slippery slope. Here is another example. If you vote for the Liberal Party, they will raise taxes and introduce more social policies. Eventually, these policies will make our country a socialist country, and we will start to look like the Soviet Union or China. We will have no freedom. Our democracy will crumble, and millions of people will be arrested and die. That is what will happen if you vote for the Liberals. Well, of course, that probably won't happen. All of the political parties are generally the same anyway. Hasty generalization. If you ever hear people making arguments about all teenagers, all millennials, all French people, all conservatives, or all teachers, you can probably assume that they are making a hasty generalization. This is when you make a claim based on only a few examples, rather than real substantive evidence. When we take the actions of a small group of people, then use this to generalize about a large class of people, this is a generalization. If one teenager says something rude to you on the bus, it doesn't mean that all teenagers nowadays are so rude. If one French person doesn't speak English to you, it doesn't mean French people don't like speaking English. You need to be careful about taking one example and using it to argue about a whole group of people. Here is another example of a hasty generalization. People today are not as hardworking as previous generations. All people? I'm sure there are very hardworking people now, just as there were in the past. Appeal to ignorance. The appeal to ignorance is used to describe the situation when you argue something must be true or must be false because it has not been proven yet, and there is no evidence to suggest you are wrong. This is the kind of fallacy conspiracy theorists often use. Scientists can't prove aliens have never visited the planet Earth, so it makes sense to believe that they have visited the planet Earth. Or religious debates often use this fallacy as well. If you can't disprove the existence of God, it makes sense to believe in God. Well, not being able to disprove something doesn't prove your argument. There are some very famous examples of this, and actually of all of the fallacies I mentioned today, usually coming from Donald Trump in during his time as president of the United States. During the aftermath of the 2020 US election, he tweeted, "You have no sufficient evidence that Donald Trump did not suffer from voter fraud." Well, it should be his responsibility to prove there was voter fraud. Appeal to authority. When you argue or debate, it is good to use experts' opinions or research as evidence. However, if you misuse the opinion of an expert, we call this the appeal to authority fallacy. An authority's opinion becomes a fallacy when it is overstated, irrelevant, or illegitimate. What does this mean? Well, think about the famous podcaster Joe Rogan. He has the biggest podcast in the world, and he is famous for using the appeal to authority. He will always use the guests on his podcast's opinions as evidence in future episodes, even if they are not actually experts on an issue. Especially when it came to COVID-19, Joe Rogan, and actually in the wider media everywhere, people would quote nutritionists, physiotherapists, chiropractors, masseuses, and their friends, I guess, instead of actually quoting doctors focusing on more relevant issues like viruses and public health. Don't assume something is true just because an authority says it is. Check who that authority is and check that they should be talking about that certain issue. If you're an expert, if someone is an expert on, I don't know, medicine, well, it doesn't mean they're an expert on nuclear physics. And often, celebrities and public figures are also paid to say things. Here's an example. The actor Brad Pitt criticized the president's foreign policy. Well, why does that matter? Brad Pitt is not a foreign policy expert, right? Appeal to pity. The final fallacy I'll talk about today is the appeal to pity. This is where you make an emotional argument to win the debate rather than using factual evidence. The idea is to influence and distract everyone with emotions so they don't listen to the real evidence. Here are some examples. My grandma just died and I lost my job last week, so please give me a better grade on the assignment. Or, we should go to the pizza restaurant for dinner tonight because I'll be sad if we don't go. So, here is today's final thought. On this episode of Thinking in English, I have introduced 8 of the most common logical fallacies that people make when arguing. These are mistakes that weaken your debate and are not based on relevant or strong evidence. Politicians, newspapers, and internet users constantly use these ways of arguing, so it's important you are aware and recognize them. In fact, you've probably realized that a lot of my examples were kind of political in nature. And this is because a lot of our arguments are political arguments, and people are terrible, really, really bad at arguing about politics because we get emotional and we often dislike the other side. So our argument is not always based on evidence, but instead based on, we think that person's an idiot, or uh, we read in the newspaper something from an authority that was not a real authority. So we have to be careful about not using logical fallacies when we debate. Have you ever had an argument with someone using one of these fallacies? Have you ever used one yourself? And can you think of any examples of these fallacies you've heard in real life? If you can, leave a comment on the blog, leave a comment on Spotify, or send me a message on Instagram. I'd really curious to know what kind of arguments you have been in, and if you've ever had to argue with someone who maybe is not very good at arguing. I sometimes get messages on Instagram that people want to argue with me, but they don't. They just kind of insult me instead.